Ken, now you have the challenge of how does a lawyer take, what's the lawyer's take on this discussion?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to be part of this panel. I'm going to be brief this morning and focus on one particular aspect, and that is compliance. Without compliance with the EIA requirements and enforcement of EIA terms, all the hard work, costly and lengthy assessment will be greatly minimized. The value of that work without compliance will be minimized. Compliance forms the basis for rule of law. Without compliance, all we have in an EIA or otherwise is just words on paper. Without rule of law, we can't govern. If we can't govern, we cannot meet our sustainable development objectives. That's true in climate change, that's true in water, that's in hazardous waste, all aspects of environmental protection. EIAs are one of the most prevalent forms of rules of law around the world today. Without compliance with the terms of our EIAs, they really the impact becomes minimized. I'm speaking from a perspective from the International Network for Environmental Compliance and Enforcement, or INES, and many of you may not be familiar with INES. We are a global network of 120 environmental protection agencies around the world, with also international organizations such as OECD, the World Bank, UNEP, the Secretariats as major partners. INES has three main goals, which is to raise the awareness of the importance of compliance across all aspects of the regulatory cycle, including, in many countries, EIAs, which form the most basic and prominent part of an environmental protection program. INES also builds capacity for ensuring compliance and enforcement, as well as developing networks for enforcement cooperation for governments to work together better to assure compliance with the environmental laws that they create. I just returned late last evening from Japan, where I was working with approximately 15 Asian governments on the issues of compliance and enforcement. An environmental impact assessment featured prominently in that discussion. How are we going to better assure compliance with our environmental impact assessments? And if you'll permit me, I'd just like to provide just a few examples that we learned about. And further, this work could be evaluated in a report that was prepared by the Asian Development Bank and the USAID funded jointly. But we learned that Malaysia is currently working on how to include climate change at the project level, as is Singapore. Indonesia is considering global impact of climate change in environmental impact assessment and believes that cumulative impacts are factoring into climate change into the planning. It requires a higher level of consideration, but cannot be incorporated at the project level. So we have this big challenge, programmatic versus project level, on how we consider climate change in that. The Philippines also currently working on strategic environmental assessment guidelines for integrating climate risk reduction concerns as part of an attempt to elevate climate change considerations in environmental impact assessment from the project level to the strategic and sectoral levels. In the Maldives, which has plans to become carbon neutral by 2020, all projects now need to consider greenhouse gas emissions in the EIA process. And Sri Lanka, as well, is looking at climate change adaptation measures into consideration in many policy areas, such as flood control management. In addition, the water sector and projects in the coastal zones are giving serious consideration to climate change. To be effective, many of the adaptation measures require interventions at the policy and planning levels. Why is this important? It's important because countries around the world, developing countries who we work with often with INES, are trying to find new mechanisms for addressing climate change. And what we are working to do is help them to develop the enforceability of these requirements in their assessments. INES is right now undertaking an initiative that will look at working together with governments to help raise the level of compliance in the EIA process. That starts with making sure these EIAs are enforceable, having a program for implementation. Program of implementation doesn't stop there. You need to work at 2 levels to assure compliance. We need compliance promotion. How do we get the technical assistance, the work out there to give those governments the proper tools to assure compliance? But there also needs to be a stick. What happens if what you do is not complied with? There needs to be enforcement. It needs to be fair, rapid, and meaningful enforcement. So working from the compliance promotion, the carrot, but you also need the stick. And if that doesn't work, if the policies still aren't working, we need to go back and assess to figure out how do we best use indicators and other tools to assess whether or not that program is meeting its underlying objectives, and possibly to retool our policies and start the cycle over again. So I just want to leave you with those words. Without compliance, our words on paper are meaningless. So as you consider environmental impact assessment, I urge you to consider how are we going to assure compliance with the terms of the underlying documents. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. Can I just ask a clarifying question? Because you use compliance in 2 terms. One is the sort of doing the EIA and the technical quality, and then the provisions in the EIA, which we would call in banks the environmental management plan, and most countries would call a permit. Do you have an idea of where the vulnerabilities or the failures lie? Is it doing the EIA and doing it competently, or is it following actually the environmental management plan in some way, shape, or form, whether it's permanent or not?
We focus primarily on the environmental management plan, the second part, but I do believe that the accountability of governments to properly conduct the EIA is the starting point. So we would like to see compliance at both levels. INES primarily functions at the practitioner and the working level, so that we'd like to see once a plan is set in action that it is implemented properly and that there is accountability from the project to the project proponent. So that would be the area of our emphasis moving forward.
Great, thanks. Okay, thank you for the speakers for keeping to the time. So even though we started late, we still have at least 10 minutes for questions, and a little longer if we were asked to cut in the lunch. And I see 2 questions here, one and then the second.